I think people who sort of have been incredibly negative to my message, I think they're deliberately being obtuse. They don't want to hear the facts. The facts basically being that no country on earth has ever achieved long-term growth and reduced poverty by relying on aid to the extent that African countries rely on aid today. This is a fact, it's not me making it up. It's also a fact that the international community, the World Bank, the IMF, international development agencies are very familiar with the detrimental aspect of aid. If you look at the back of my book, I cite a lot of that literature. And so I think it's very simplistic of those people who've been critical of the message. I think they just don't either they don't understand, which would be very tragic, or they're deliberately pretending not to understand. I suppose it depends on what you mean. And I think what tends to happen in this space is that there's always a new buzzword. Over the past 50 or 60 years in Africa, we're seeking one thing, which is basically growth and sustained growth, but also the link to that, the reduction of poverty. So however you want to dress that, I think it's just, it's largely smoke and mirrors. So for example, nobody would object to the Millennium Development Goals as a good idea in concept. But I don't think there are policymakers who did not know that before we put the Millennium Development Goals on paper. We already knew that we're trying to reduce poverty, we want more kids to go to school, we want to put a dent in healthcare costs and the fact that many people don't have access to healthcare. And so I think that the international community and African policymakers are very guilty of having a lot of opportunity and talking a lot, but very little in terms of doing very little in terms of implementation. So I mean, I don't know what that means with defining development. I mean, I have no understanding of what that specifically means, but I'm assuming we've all been doing the same thing for the past 60 years, which is trying to get higher growth in Africa and reduction in poverty. So if that means something different, I'm very open to hear what that means. I don't know what that means.
We have to begin to, you know, if I can pick up on a word that Dambisa used about 4 times already, and that is growth. Part of what we need to do is begin to question the quality of growth, because basically we have a growth model that does not work for the majority of the people in the world. What we have in the world today is what you could call jobless growth and growth without equity. In fact, the growth that we've had, particularly since the fall of the Berlin Wall, where we've had a surge of neoliberalism, we have seen actually in virtually every single country in the world, the gap between the rich and poor growing at an astronomical rate, and also the gap between rich and poor countries growing quite fundamentally. So when we talk about right now redefining development, we have to basically almost say there are no holy cows, and in that case, in that sense, I think Dambisa's book is helpful in the sense that it makes a provocative statement. While I disagree with the conclusion of it, some of the observations are obviously helpful.
We as Africans or citizens of the developing world are not entitled to the taxpayers' money coming from abroad. And I think that's fundamentally the problem. You go to visit with many African policymakers or policymakers in a lot of the places in the emerging world, and somehow there's an expectation that we're entitled to this money. And I think the problem with that is that ultimately policymakers start to view these aid flows as permanent income. The Marshall Plan succeeded to the extent that there was a clear, sharp, short intervention. We've seen those type of interventions in the emerging world in the form of the graduates, which I talk about, so 22 countries that actually did receive aid in a very finite manner, and money was subsequently shut off, and there was actually meaningful progress in terms of economic development. And I think that we're not having this discussion. People are very happy to go to the G20 and G8 meetings and ask for more money, forgetting that not only are we not entitled, but Western countries themselves have their own problems. They have aging populations, which are invariably going to lead to social costs in terms of pension funds that are unfunded, as we know. The United States has a 10% unemployment rate. We are seeing a lot of structural problems. In fact, my next book is precisely on these issues, the fact that we are seeing economic decline. My view is that we live in an amazing time. We are a born witness to China moving 300 million people out of poverty in 30 years. India has more people in the middle class than anywhere else, more than Europe combined. So why are we sitting around, somehow feeling bad? In fact, we're feeling bad for Africa when Africa has fewer poor people in absolute numbers than China and India. And I think that all these points are to say that we know what has driven economic growth in these countries, in the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, but also in places like South Africa and Botswana. And we know that aid has never, ever been the catalyst for economic growth to the extent that it can meaningfully reduce poverty across the world. And yet, the world continues to push a strategy of aid onto Africa. The notion that countries and banks and organizations cannot access the capital markets because the Western markets have been hit by the financial crisis is completely absurd. There's a lot of money, and there are still people making considerable investments in incredible investment projects. I think we're so obsessed with focusing on America and Western Europe. Clearly they have problems. I mean, America itself is borrowing from China. Why would an African country, let's say Zambia, which is where I'm from, why would we focus on going to borrow money in the United States when America itself is borrowing from China? That makes no sense. So my view is that the Chinese, people from the Middle East, have a better understanding of pricing risk in Africa, and I think that is a way for us to explore new opportunities. Other countries are doing it. They've done it before. These are the countries in the emerging world. I was just in Brazil 2 weeks ago. They're turning the story around. It cannot be the case that we've just had a financial crisis. America's got massive deficits. Britain is going to be suffering under the weight of enormous debt. How can we as Africans just sit back and say, well, let's just go back for more of the same? Give us 1% of your GDP as aid flow. I mean, something has to give. Something has to change.
African civil society, which is what I'm part of, when we actually ask for aid to be honored, right? Aid to be honored and respected. What we are asking for is not charity. We are asking for justice. When Nelson Mandela and I stood in Trafalgar Square and launched the Make Poverty History campaign in 2005, and when we said 35 years is a long time to wait for less than 1%, because the commitment on the level of aid, 0.7%, is not something that was struck out 5-10 years ago. It was a commitment made in 1970, more than, at that time it was 35 years. The Marshall Plan, by the way, was 4 years, but it was 1% delivered with no conditionalities and so on.